Hello. I've got the door open and I kind of hope you can hear the birds singing, but that also means that you might be able to hear some traffic noise in the background. But it's such a nice day, so I'm going to leave it open. A while ago I spoke to you about some sludge that I had made from avocado pits and skins. It was basically a dye stock. And a friend had given me an old sheet that was well past its use by date, and I had reclaimed some cotton from the sheet to use to dye some samples with my sludge. That sounded a lot simpler than it was. What I learned is that the chemical process for natural dyeing is a little more complicated than I had realised. I think the thing is that when I'm used to using acid dyes on wool, and that requires a consistent process across all colours, but of course when you're using plant matter, all the plants are slightly different. So the process is going to be slightly different. The first thing I learned is that when you go on YouTube and you look up people who are naturally dyeing, they talk about mordanting whatever fibre you're using with alum. Now, when you go and actually try to buy alum, it's a little more complicated than that. So, basically, what I discovered, I was partway through dyeing my little samples here. I'd made my dye stock by boiling up all the pits and skins. The first thing I learnt was that I didn't need nearly as many as I thought I did. I think I could have gotten enough dye stock to dye these 3 little samples, maybe out of 4 or 5 either avocado stones or the skins. Rather than having to collect a whole freezer full. And so I had bought alum off Amazon for a reasonable price and was about to go ahead and weigh out what I needed to morden my fabric. And I contacted a friend who has much more experience than natural dyeing than I do, and she told me, what do you have, aluminium acetate or aluminium sulfate? And I was like, what? As it turns out, you use aluminium acetate to dye cellulose fibres, so plant fibres. And did I just say that? Aluminium acetate for plant fibres, cellulose. And aluminium sulfate for protein fibres, like wool, animal fibres. And what I had was the much more inexpensive aluminium sulfate, and what I wanted to dye was cotton. Anyway, fortunately, my friend, who has more experience than me with natural dyeing, has done a lot of research and happened to have a very good book. And so what she suggested I do was to use a tannin process before I actually mordanted and then used my dye stock on the fabric. And she said that I could use some of my avocado sludge to do this. Now, the purpose of all of this is to make your fabric slightly more colour fast. I think that naturally dyed fabrics tend to fade a lot quicker than other processes. So it's just a thing. But if I can kind of prolong the colour or at least do some experiments that might prolong the colour, then I'm happy to do that. This also made me wonder what the difference is between dyeing and staining something. I can stain things permanently very successfully and they never seem to fade, so yeah. Anyway, so the first thing I did was, with a couple of my samples, so these two, was to soak them in some of the dye stock. First of all, I soaked them in water so that they were well saturated. Then I soaked them in some of the dye stock, which actually stained the fabric a little. And then, with all three samples, I soaked them in the aluminium sulfate that I had. And then I boiled them all in my dye stock. So this is the one that I haven't done the tannin process with. I put this straight into the aluminium sulfate and then to mordant, and then I put them in with the others in my dye stock and boiled them for ages. So that, and as you can see, well, you will see in a minute when I show the other one, this one is a lot lighter. It hasn't taken up the colour, and I wonder if that's just because it wasn't kind of pre-stained. So that's compared to this piece of fabric, which I don't know if you'll be able to see the lovely splodges this has on it. So with this one, I'm enjoying those splodges. I don't know if, like, as I say, I don't know if you could see them there. They remind me a little bit of batik fabrics. So with this one, I soaked it in a bit of my dye stock. Let's start from scratch. I soaked it in, I completely wetted it, then I soaked it in dye stock, which meant that it was slightly stained. And then I mordanted it in the aluminium sulfate, and then I boiled it for ages and ages in the dye stock. I also left it overnight out in my greenhouse just to sit, and then boiled it again. I did that with all these samples. There's another story about leaving things in the greenhouse. I'll tell you that at the end. So this is the difference in colour here. I quite like this really soft sort of blush pinky brown. Sorry, I'm holding them in front of my face while I'm talking. Yeah, so that's those two. This third one here, I used the same process as I did for the darker one. And I don't know if you'll be able to see. So that was to wet the fabric completely, to use the tannin process, to my head just did a flip like that because I've just put up a new dog barrier along the base of my hedge, and I thought that my slippery little dog had just found a hole in it, which he hasn't. He is insisting on inspecting this barrier endlessly for holes, so I am a bit worried about it. I don't think I need to be though. Anyway, back to avocado dyeing. With this one, I had completely soaked it, and then I'd gone through the tannin process of soaking it in a bit of my avocado dye stock. Then I mordanted it in the aluminium sulfate, and then I folded it up into a little square to see if, and tied it up. And I don't know if you can see, there's a very subtle check pattern on it. It's very subtle. Yeah, I kind of wish that I hadn't stained it in that first tannin process, and then maybe that check pattern would have been less subtle. But anyway, and then I thought that I would try dyeing some wool. And I'm aware that natural dyeing is kind of a long process. The longer you can just leave things floating around in the dye stock, the better. So as I had aluminium sulfate, which is what you use on protein fibres, I had some Jameson and Smith jumper weight in an off-white, almost cream colour. It wasn't the ecru colour, it was a little darker than that I didn't particularly like, and so I just made up some little samples of that, just made them into little hanks, and I made sure it was thoroughly soaked, and then I mordanted it in the aluminium sulfate, and then I heated up my dye stock and I put the yarn into the dye stock, and I was going away for a few days, and so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to leave this whole thing out in the greenhouse. I leave it in the greenhouse because it's a bit warm in there, so you know, maybe a bit of solar dyeing going on, and then I thought, oh, when I come back I'll boil it again and just see what colour I've got. I got back home after 4 days and the whole thing had gone completely mouldy, so I threw it out. So that was my first wool dyeing adventure. I think there will be other natural dyeing adventures in my life. As I said, this process was a little more complicated than I had anticipated because I bought the wrong stuff. And I think also what this made me realise is that just natural dyeing doesn't mean that the chemicals that you're using are any less kind of toxic to yourself or to the environment when they're in concentration. So, yeah, my adventures in natural dyeing will continue, but not at a very fast pace. Anyway, that is my little postcard to you. I don't think I said at the minute. My name's Lee, and this is my little postcard to you about my makerly life. And it's nice to have a chat to you. I would love to hear if you've had any interesting experiments that didn't quite go as you thought they would over the summer. Leave me a comment below. It's always nice to hear what you're up to. And I shall see you next time. Cheerio.